All right, everybody. I just posted a video about a incident that happened in New Jersey in 1973. I wanted to illustrate some principles of what happens in much more realistic combat. It's still a challenge match between two peoples, teenagers. So in a sense, it's ritual male violence, but it really escalated. Um, and see my previous video about that traditional karate versus grappling and leopard fist. However, so I posted, and Jose, who recounted this incident to me, who he gave a reply or a little review of my video, and he mentioned something about mindset, the right fighter with the right mindset. Okay, because in the 60s, 70s, even part of the 80s, depending on where you trained, traditional karate, traditional kung fu was trained differently. The material often is the same. Like when it comes to the number of techniques and the use of heavy bags and focus pads and modern equipment and better exercises, of course, a lot of the martial arts schools are ahead of us in that way. But when it comes to the grittiness of combat, being able to use traditional techniques, not just a lot of stand-up traditional schools, when they spar, it looks like kickboxing or something like that, right? And many of the distinct techniques in their style they cannot use. I mean, I was in the ATA, right, for a while. When I was in the military, they had an ATA club at Norfolk, and I trained there when I was ever at my home station, and whenever I went on a mission forward deployed somewhere, whatever there was, I trained. So, I trained some Kenpo, I trained some Greco-Roman, I, worked the bag, I worked with wrestlers and boxers and whatnot. But when I was at Norfolk, I trained the ATA, and we had ridge hands in our forms, spear hands, palm strikes, elbow smashes, knee smashes, low kicks. We had techniques that could have possibly been takedowns and joint locks, but we never practiced them. Right? We did continuous sparring. It looked a bit like kickboxing. Not that that was bad, right? But Jose communicated to me something about mindset. And in the previous story that I mentioned tonight, I talked about Craig DeVries. He kicked an opponent who completed a takedown or fell on him, something to that effect. And he tried to rip his lip with a fish hook. The guy started chewing on his fingers. He extracted a hand, started leopard fisting. I'm assuming he hit him on the neck, possibly throat, whatever it was. It made that trained grappler that had street fighting experience that outweighed him and outreached him get right up. And he was able to deploy a kick. Craig was against the grappler, right? So there's a certain mindset there. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the mental, possibly spiritual dimensions of martial arts. This is very esoteric stuff. I'm gonna try and dive deep in this, and some of you are going to tune out, and others of you have been there, and some of you, I'm trying to reach those that have not been there, but that are open-minded to this, because this can be life-changing. Okay, what does it take to be the kind of person that when you've been taken off your feet, out of your comfort zone, you prefer to be on the outside range, someone bigger and stronger gets on top of you and starts punching you? What does it take to instinctively, reflexively attempt a maiming technique? And then when that maiming technique is countered with a counter-maiming technique, to start deploying an alternate technique successfully from the bottom where you don't have leverage for punches. Yes, of course, you need knowledge of those techniques. But that wrestler, for example, probably never trained biting techniques, but he began to bite on him, right? There's a certain mindset there. And mind you, these guys weren't raised in the ghetto. This is Hamilton, New Jersey. These are white kids. Some white supremacists don't consider Italians white people or Puerto Ricans, so this gets tricky, right? But these are not, they didn't grow up in impoverished areas from what I can tell. But yet they have this mentality. It's a street fighter's mentality. I'll tell you what causes that. A, probably most importantly, at some point, someone somewhere had to beat up on you. Someone, somehow, somewhere was an attacker and an oppressor. And this is going to sound wacky, but one of the greatest gifts a man can have, and this is for men. This is for men. Women's lives are a little different, but not as different nowadays as they were back then. One of the greatest, let's say as a fighter, one of the greatest gifts as a fighter is an ass whooping you survive that doesn't do that much permanent damage. It's one of the greatest gifts you'll ever have. Okay? Because then you know what kind of person you are. And if you're a fighter, you respond to that by improving and getting better, striving to destroy that opponent. Okay? Carlos Castaneda, who's a famous writer back in the day, and a lot of his works I admire, and some of his backstory is BS. But he said a very wise thing, which is that a man of power, a shaman, a warrior, he actually welcomes petty tyrants in his life. Petty tyrants are people that try to use their power and control you and oppress you. And you use your relationship with them to overcome them and develop your personal power. Your power as a warrior. And when he says warrior, he's talking about esoteric things like mental, spiritual development, sorcery, things like that. And yes, I understand Carlos Castaneda's book, they're half bullshit, but the half that isn't bullshit is actually pretty deep. Right? Another thing is how your parents raised you, the conditions of your childhood. I can tell something about you, Jose. I can tell something about you and Craig and Jojo Agabetti, right? And you can correct me if I'm wrong in person, but I'm going to suspect that, Hamilton is a high-income area. It has a lot of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. Then it has a lot of Italian people, as a black population, as a Puerto Rican population, and smaller immigrant populations. But, the richer kids, the higher status kids are usually white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and the Italians sort of a cluster somewhere below them on the totem pole, right? With a name like De Vries, that actually sounds Dutch. Jojo Agabetti, that's an Italian name, and you, Jose Gonzalez, are Puerto Rican. And Puerto Ricans are citizens. They're Americans, for those of you who are ignorant of what that means, right? But you're a very diverse group of friends that bonded together. And that automatically tells me you may not have been outcasts, but you are not part of the in-group. Actually, the person that was probably most socially connected was Jojo Agabetti, just by his name, just by the fact that he was Italian. Meant that he had a social group around him that he was part of that would support him, right? Craig De Vries could have fitted in with the white kids, but he doesn't strike me as an upper crust kid. He strikes me as more from a blue collar family like you. And I met Jojo, and Jojo gave off that blue collar vibe. So you guys were part of the same socioeconomic class, but from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and you bonded together as a group, which means that in a sense, you were kind of outliers, renegades, outlaws in a sense. And that gave you a need to be strong and to fight, not just to bond together and fight, but to develop skills. Right? Am I wrong? So that's what's missing in a lot of modernized martial arts these days, even if they're practicing the same old katas and same old techniques. What's missing is the mindset and the intent of how it was trained. Right? Now, what if you don't have it, or you've never been in that situation? You've never had your butt whooped a few times. You've never had to defend yourself against bullies. How do you develop that mindset? How do you develop the mindset if you're a housewife, a businessman, a young kid who grew up playing video games, and you're trying to learn martial arts? And you're like, I don't think I could ever try to gouge someone's eyes or hit him in the throat. I don't think I could ever raise to that level of violence, of escalation of violence, even if it was necessary to save my life. Well, mindset really is in the mind. And the mind is a funny thing. The mind doesn't actually have to go through a thing to actually simulate it. You know what I mean? Like, if a dog walks down the street, I'm not physically touching the dog. I'm not in contact with the dog. I don't know how it's thinking. I'm filtering it through my senses. So I sense the dog indirectly. And most things in the world you're sensing very indirectly by looking at it and listening to it. Sometimes you bump into it. Sometimes you interact with it. That's when when you're interacting and it's interacting on you, and you're in visual, auditory, tactile, sensory contact. Then you're in touch with it. You're aware of it in a more real sense than watching it pass by. But your brain constructs a map of everything that's going on, and it uses that to navigate, and it remembers that map and it uses it again. It's like, oh, you don't have to be surprised every time a dog passes by. You're like, I've seen dogs before. You just note if this dog is particularly bigger or smaller. So you can create simulations in your mind. That's what hypnosis and guided meditation and visualization is all about. So I'm going to give people out there that are like, well, how could I, I'm a recreational martial artist. I'm not training 6-7 hours a day in the MMA gym. Even if you're in an MMA gym, you may be there 2 or 3 times a week. You may be studying karate, taekwondo, kung fu, wing chun, kali, but you're not a pro. You may have never been in a street fight, but how do you develop that mentality where you can deploy 100% of your capacities and you can do what's necessary, even if it's distasteful or scary, and you can do it under pressure? You need to learn how to focus your mind and body and actions and bring them together to your intent. So Stephen Barnes talked about an exercise he puts his clients through. It's like a hypnosis and meditation exercise where people want to overcome fear. And what he has them do is for 48 hours, for 2 days, he has them think about and meditate as often as possible all the people that they love, all the things that they value, everything that they hold sacred, their children, their wife, their husband, their family, their honor, it could be a feeling, it could be their car, every possible thing that they love and value, right? And when they have that strength in their mind, that image, all that's wonderful and holy in the world for them, then he has them think about, someone coming to hurt that, take it away, to kill it, to destroy it, to rape it, to smash it, to mangle it, to maim it, to steal it, whatever. And then he's like, all you have to do is look the person in the right eye and think, I'm going to take my fingers, these 3 fingers, and I'm going to shove them into that eye. And I don't care if I die or not, because that's the only thing that will stop that person. You create a scenario where if you can successfully do that, then all those people and all those things are safe because of you. You think about what it is you would die for. And then if you're ready, committed to doing that, you won't have the fear. Okay? That's one thing. Right? The other thing is, of course, there's the motivation of fear. Also, this is a little bit different, a little bit lower level, but if you can picture what you value and what you would die for, and that you successfully attacking that eye, in that right eye of that person, that's going to give you the ability to stare people down, right? Me, I always looked at the throat, and I was like, if he moves, I'm going to hit him, right? Another thing you can do is you can do a guided meditation where you visualize yourself sort of walking by, some remote area, a junkyard, and you imagine that these attackers are coming at you, and they have, maybe a chain, weapons. They're all bigger, stronger, tougher than you, and you visualize yourself that the minute. Usually this is done with an instructor, right? The minute the instructor says, 1, you're on the floor, your eyes are closed, you're meditating, you're lying flat. 1, you're going to jump up and throw the 3 hardest, fastest punches you ever threw in your life, right? And you do that. And then you begin your workout. Okay? Because what you've done is you by visualizing these situations and then translating it into effective, powerful action, right? You begin to develop the ability to move into that dangerous, fearful situation, right? You don't do this more than once per workout, and I wouldn't do it more than once per week, but you start doing this, and it starts to develop that ability to fearlessly attack, to fearlessly move and react in the face of danger. And then also at the American Karate Institute, Rick Hahn, when he trained me, we always looked at the throat. When the person moved, we reacted. That's how we did our drills, right? And you had a person in front of you, but you were using control, but sometimes you'd put chest padding, you could strike the chest padding. And then what he'd do is he'd have you face a bag, and instead of just rolling on the bag, you'd be in your stance. And whenever he called out a number, 1, you'd hit it 3 to 5 times. Sometimes it was 3, sometimes it was 5, and you'd blast it and then recover and then relax again. Here you go, 2, right? So you're training yourself to respond off a trigger, to go into no mind. And the trigger is looking at that throat. And then sometimes it was auditory. Your back would be turned to the bag or something, or the opponent would be behind you, and they would attack and they would pull their punch. And sometimes you were able to respond to it and continue your combination with control, right? So you train your mind. You try to develop your subconscious mind to where it can turn that intensity on with a trigger, by being triggered by an external stimuli. And you can deploy your full speed, your full power, and your full focus, with or without control, on a target, or partially on a human being, or pulled on a human being, or blasting a heavy bag at any given moment off of that trigger, right? And then you also do exercises, like the one where I'm going to put this finger into your right eye no matter what you do, right? And what happens is when a threat does come in front of you, you've been in that state. You've dealt with the adrenaline dump, and you've learned to move through it competently. And your mind has a clear mission and a clear goal. All it begins to think of is, I'm going to look at that throat. If he moves at me, he's going to get blasted. I'm going to look at that right eye. No matter what he does, I'm going to tunnel into it with my fingers if he dares threaten me. Because if he threatens me, he's threatening all these things behind me. Right? And let me tell you something. When you have that, when people are trying to intimidate you, threaten you, and you go into this cold, calculated, like a snake, a cobra waiting to pounce, when you go into that mode, most bullies sense it and they go away. They find an excuse to de-escalate or leave. They may step back a foot or two and yell and scream and call you all sorts of names, but they're doing it with the intent of saving face, and they're leaving. And yes, in your life, a few times there may be those that will not back down or are too dumb to realize what's happening, and they'll move at you. And you know what? You won't even hit them. Your subconscious mind will. You will react, because that's what your training is for. You know how to punch. You know how to kick. You've hit targets. You've worked with people. You've sparred. But you'll have this mindset you can switch on and off. And to be honest with you, once it's deep in your subconscious mind, it knows when to turn itself on and off. As a matter of fact, it will probably turn itself on a lot, and you'll have to learn to turn it off and calm it down. But it'll be an automatic defense, kind of like an anti-missile defense, right? Something to think about, folks. All right, something to think about. You all have a wonderful night. And remember, your mind is your most potent weapon. Have a good night.